Hi, today I'd like to talk to you about something that on the surface probably seems reasonably simple. What is a native speaker? Today, obviously, I'm focused on native English speakers, but there's nothing here that couldn't be equally applied to a native speaker of any other language, right? So what is a native speaker? It seems reasonably intuitive, but as we'll see, this this phrase has been problematized in various ways over the years, and some people are showing us that it's sometimes not as simple as we think, right? So native speakers are varied in that they come from around the world, right? Here we have former President of the United States, Bill Clinton. Here we have former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Margaret Thatcher. They sound noticeably different, or sounded, in the case of Thatcher, who's now dead, but they sounded quite different one from another, and yet if you were to hear them, you would certainly recognize them as native speakers of English. Interestingly, even with people who never really existed, such as Wallace and Gromit here, the human one is Wallace, I believe. Yes, Wallace. You'd recognize him as a native English speaker, even though well, first of all, it's not a real person, but also it's not a real voice, right? The person who creates the voice for this character, or similarly, perhaps for people more familiar with North America, Foghorn Leghorn, who's also not a real person. He's not even a person, right? He's a big anthropomorphic chicken. And yet the voice is certainly, and again, the voice is not the voice of the actor who plays, the voice actor who plays the chicken, right? But in both the case of Wallace and Foghorn Leghorn, you would certainly recognize their voices as being native speaker, even though they are not real people's voices, right? It's that sort of intuitive thing, like when people say, I know what art is, I recognize it when I see it. I know what a native speaker is, I recognize when I hear it. Is it always so simple? Here's my regular guy who I use to represent reasonable opinions that we might expect someone to have about a topic like this, right? The regular guy would probably think that a person is a native speaker of the language that she or he learned first, right? Makes sense. The benefits that come with that, as Davies point out, is that native speakers are seen as Davies writes, models, right? That native speakers know the truth about the language, what is possible and what isn't, right? I've long ago heard someone say, but I've lost the quotation, that as a native speaker of a language, it's as if you have a memory of sentences as yet unheard, right? That someone can say a new sentence, one that you've never heard before, but it's as if in your memory you think, yes, I've heard that before. That's something we can say in our language, right? That's something along the lines of what Chomsky, the famous linguist Noam Chomsky, was showing how with a sentence that, of course, now it's a very famous sentence, but at the time he was trying to create a sentence no one would have heard before, and he said, colorless green ideas sleep furiously. And he was showing that semantically this doesn't make sense, right? How can an idea be green? If it's green, how can it be colorless? How can an idea sleep? If you're sleeping, how can you sleep furiously, right? In terms of meaning, this doesn't make sense, but in terms of grammar, if a native speaker hears colorless green ideas sleep furiously, they'll say, yeah, well, that works grammatically, although it doesn't work semantically, right? It's as if they've heard that sentence before and can easily then say, yes, that's acceptable. And so we often think that that's how native speakerism, that native speakerness, I should say, native speakerism is different. We'll come to that later. Native speakerness is something that gives us that intimate knowledge of what's acceptable and what isn't in a language, and it's something that you're born with, as Cook says, right? Other advantages of being a native English speaker, and of course a native speaker of any language, that are at least seen to be advantages and seen to be true. They aren't all necessarily true, right? Is that native usage is by definition right, as right says, right? That the way native speakers talk is correct. I don't think he necessarily meant that native speakers never make mistakes as individuals. Sure, sometimes I say something grammatically inaccurate. There's three reasons instead of there are three reasons, something like that, which technically is not correct. But then when he says native usage is by definition right, what he means is that if enough people do it, enough native speakers do something, it becomes accepted, it becomes right. That if enough people say, I just said there's three reasons, that's the kind of thing that a lot of people wouldn't even notice unless, like now, I drew attention to it, and that over time may in fact become correct, may come to be accepted as correct, that there is distinction when we're using there is to as an existential there, right? When you say there are three reasons, there's three reasons, what you mean is three reasons exist. That eventually we won't bother distinguishing ever between there are and there is, because really the grammar there is not important. What's important is that there are together make the meaning of exist, right? And so that native speakers collectively, their usage of such things provide our knowledge of what's right. And of course, what's right may change over time. Native speakers. Now, here's where we get to things that are obviously, that I hope you can see are much more, controversial, much less obvious than ideal, that a native speaker is the ideal language teacher. Maybe some advantages, but I think you can see, and if, for example, you read Medgesh 1992, there is one of the most well-known, there's newer stuff, but this one was such a good summary, of advantages of native speakers, but also advantages of non-native speakers of the language, what they can do better than native English speakers, right? That a non-native speaker can provide a successful model of learning, that a non-native English speaker will know what the students are going through, because he or she has gone through the process of learning another language, especially if he or she speaks the same first language as the students. They'll know the common transfer errors from the first language to English, right? So this is often, but again, I'm going with the regular guy here, right? A regular person would probably just think native teacher is best, right? And so the detrimental thing for non-native teachers, of which there are a lot more around the world, right? There's a lot more non-native speakers of English teaching English than there are native speakers of English teaching English, right? Think of all those countries all around the world where people are learning English, and the majority of them from non-native English speakers. But the great detriment then is that those non-native speakers are often seen as less proficient in the language. And to be fair, they may be less proficient. They may not speak across the full range of domains as well as a native English speaking teacher. But that doesn't always matter, right? Because they may be teaching within certain domains, certain topics, certain uses, right? Certain registers. And so it may be enough to be fluent in many areas, but not all. And there's this feeling, though, as Quirk says here, that if you're a non-native English speaker, you need to keep topping up your knowledge from native speaker interactions, which is the kind of thing that, of course, leads to demand for native English speakers as teachers around the world, in often being paid more than non-native teachers who work in the same country, because of that feeling that we need native speakers to make the language teaching authentic. Dictionaries, right, come from native speaker use almost entirely, right? The definitions and usages that are accepted by dictionaries are pretty much entirely based on how native speakers use the language. Journal publishing is largely done through native speakers, although this is one area where I think things have changed since that was written. I think some journals, especially journals in this domain, I don't know, in this field, right? I don't know about other fields like sciences or mathematics or what have you, but at least to do with English teaching and English language studies and linguistic studies, it's now, I think, more recognized that native speaker status doesn't provide you any special wisdom about how language works, about the analysis of language, right? And that, in fact, looking at a language from outside can often be more beneficial, right? If you're multilingual and you're studying a language, you'll have your knowledge, your meta-linguistic knowledge of 2, 3 languages to help you examine the one being studied, as opposed to being a monolingual who doesn't necessarily have any outside knowledge to draw on, right? Not to say that all native English speakers are monolingual, of course, but the more languages you know, the better, right? And so that may be beneficial for writing about language and about language teaching. Now here's a tricky one where native English speakers are often assumed to have the relevant cultural knowledge to go with the teaching, to know how the culture works. I know this is troublesome for, say, I worked in Japan for some time, and you'd have, say, a Scottish man teaching English, right? My friend Paul, and students would ask him things about America and about Australia and so on, thinking that there was a direct correlation between being an English speaker and having the associated cultural knowledge that comes from these inner circle countries where English is largely spoken natively, right? But why should a Scottish man know about, Australian pop culture or American sports and so on, right? So the cultural knowledge is assumed when it's often not true. This is like those, as it says here, those Miranda warnings. The Miranda warning is the name that you may have seen this in films about the United States, where someone is arrested and the police say to the person being arrested, they say something like, you have the right to remain silent, you have the right to an attorney, and so on, right? And Pavlenko found that many people who were arrested could speak English, right? They understood that they were being arrested, but they didn't have the cultural knowledge to really understand where they were being told to confirm when they were read their rights, as it said, their Miranda rights, to protect themselves. And so they didn't realize that answering questions in certain ways had legal implications. And so just because you speak English fluently doesn't mean you know how the American legal system works, right? I mean, that could apply to anyone, not just a non-native speaker. A British person going to America won't necessarily understand the American legal system, and so may suffer for that, right? In interactions between native and non-native speakers of any language, English here, we will find often that the native English speakers are dominant, right? That their speed and facility with the language gives them an advantage in any kind of interaction. People have studied this from the point of view of business interactions, for example, right? To see how the meetings will be dominated by native speakers of the language, which of course some may see that as a good thing, as this regular guy might. If you're more interested in fairness in business, you would not see that as a good thing. You'd want to make sure that different parties were able to take advantage equally of any good business practices despite language barriers, right? I saw a while ago on L-Test, which is a language teaching discussion group, someone wrote something like this, right? Are there any legal or ethical considerations regarding giving a language proficiency test to native speakers of the language? The feeling that giving a language test to a native speaker was somehow perhaps discriminatory, to ask someone who speaks English to take an English language test, as if this could be somehow seen as unethical or something. Which I can see why the person might think that, right? Are we testing something? Because they feel like they feel they're testing something that's inherent, that being a native speaker is inherent to your characteristics, inherent to the self, and that testing you on that might offend you or something. But of course, we do it all the time, right? I correct students' essays all the time and say you wrote, their T-H-E-I-R when you mean their T-H-E-R-E. We do it all the time. This person continued, who am I to assess another native speaker's ability? Well, teachers do that all the time, right? Following prescriptive rules, they say you're just wrong here because that's not the prescriptive way to do it, right? So of course we do that, evaluate native speakers of a language with language testing, but I can see why someone might think that that was somehow ethically problematic as this person did. Here's linguists, right? What have linguists done to talk about these issues? Sometimes agreeing, sometimes, as you might guess, disagreeing with what a regular person might say or think. Leung, Harris, Rampton, 1997, point out something which I think you'll find obvious, right? Not everybody uses English the same way. Not all native speakers use English the same way. As I said, for example, my friend Paul from Scotland speaks English differently than I do, has obviously different phonology, but also different lexical choices, sometimes even different grammatical patterns exist between different native varieties, right? Which one is, if you're using a native speaker as the correct model for teaching, for example, which one is the best way, right? And what about if we talk about non-standard? I mean, with Paul and I'm talking about standard Canadian and standard Scottish. What about speakers of non-standard language? Are there variants necessarily accepted by everyone in the way that the regular guy thinks that native speakers' language use should be accepted? I don't think that's true, right? I think there'll be prejudice against people who speak with rural accents, right? Working class varieties of language, right? Sometimes varieties that are marked by ethnolex, right? Marked by ethnic backgrounds other than being the dominant, in this case, white British ethnic background, right? So it's not as simple as to say native usage is right when there's many other factors that contribute to people thinking, well, you're speaking English, but it's not really the right English that should be used for textbooks or for teaching or for dictionaries. Countries, even Katru and others have talked about how native English speaking status applies only to English speakers from certain countries. People remember America. People remember the United Kingdom. If you push them up to think about native English speaking countries, then they'll start, oh, right, Australia, maybe New Zealand, Ireland, Canada. You can stretch them, right? But they forget that there are native English speakers in many more countries than that, right? Some where not everyone is a native speaker, but where many people are, right? Countries like India, Singapore, right? People forget about places like Costa Rica and many countries in Africa where English is sometimes an official language, sometimes not official, but where there are people for whom English is their first language, but they'll forget that those countries exist and that people from those countries are native speakers and may be hesitant to think of them as such, even if they self-identify, English is my first language. People may have adverse reaction to that, but it's a funny English because you're not from America or Britain or Australia, right? Phillipson, others are critiques of language hierarchies like this. Phillipson's probably the best known because of a book that he wrote called Linguistic Imperialism. He says that this dichotomy, as he says, this polar relationship between native and non-native, as if they're at opposite ends of a spectrum, is often based on power relations, right? He argues that it, of course, benefits native English speakers to maintain this idea that nativeness is somehow more qualified in all areas, and so allows people access to those, those better teaching jobs that I mentioned earlier, and so on, right? Better access to publishing in academic journals, which is, of course, very important for many academics. Bain says it's a useful tool of discrimination. We've had students do master's dissertations looking at various countries. The most recent one that I recall was Russia, looking at how many advertisements for English teachers in Russia specified that you must be a native speaker of English. Sometimes even advertising in Russian, in the Russian language, but advertising saying native English speakers only. And so, of course, that is problematic, discriminatory for any highly qualified, highly fluent Russian speaker of English. This is one area where I think there's been some improvement in the time that I've been aware of these things, some organizations will now no longer allow, for example, BAL, the British Association of Applied Linguistics, will not allow advertisements to specify native speaker necessary. You're allowed to write things like highly fluent, or high proficiency, excellent proficiency, but you can't just say native because it pushes away all those non-native speakers who would otherwise be qualified without even giving them any chance, right? It allows that exclusivity to be maintained. Amin is a Canadian woman, but Pakistani Canadian, right? So born in Canada and raised in Canada. Pakistani Canadian is used, we say it the opposite, right? In Britain, you would say British born Pakistani, you put the country first, then the ethnicity. In Canada, it goes the other way, right? Pakistani Canadian. And she found that people would often be hesitant to accept her as a native speaker, despite the fact that she was born in Canada. And I'm sure, I mean, this is not unique to her, right? The fact that she was born in Canada was overridden by the fact that she looked Pakistani. And so people would somehow think that there was some correlation between ethnicity and language ability that obviously we know there isn't. But people would say that, right? Over time, again, this is something that some organizations are taking a more activist stance against, right? To try to either make that forbidden, to make hiring assumptions based on race and language ability, or sometimes it has to do with country of origin, right? That, you know, places used to advertise, well, we hire people from these countries, and they'd leave out some countries, like I said, Singapore or India, where there were large numbers of native English speakers or highly proficient non-native English speakers. They'd say that basically you had to have a passport from these countries in order to apply for the job. I'm not saying that doesn't still happen, but I've seen more and more organizations that are making that against their policies, if not illegal, then at least against their policies to hire based on passport status. If you are a native English speaker, you may not understand the appeal of nativeness around the world, of native Englishness around the world, in terms of people wanting access to it for teaching purposes, right? It may be worth a sort of detour here to look at this castle, which you may think looks quite European. If we were here in person, I'd ask you where you think it is, and you might say Germany, England, I don't know. But in fact, this is in Korea, right? I believe it's called Gyeonggi English Village, where you can go on holiday. Students go here to stay, but some people go on their holiday and live in an English village. English, not in the sense of England, but a village, a hotel and environs where you use English as part of your regular life, right? Although you use American dollars, right? Pseudo-American dollars, and do the sort of things that it says here, right? Sit on a miniature airplane and interact with a stewardess to talk about would you like to have peanuts and Coke or whatever it is that they say, and then the flight attendant talks to you in English and you interact with her or him in the same way in English to practice your English as a Korean person, right? But you're spending your hard-earned money and your hard-earned vacation time going and doing this, and people like it, right? And it's not only Korea. They're in British Hills in Japan is the same kind of thing, right? You go stay, live, learn to do British stuff. I think she's baking scones here, this young Japanese woman, right? All they have English classes, but they also have classes on baking English food and English sport and so on. And so you go and live in a fake English village in the hills in Japan and spend, again, think of the appeal that it must have, right? Because you're willing to spend your money and spend your holiday time on going and doing this, just to live in an English environment for a few days or a week or what have you. Now, Kim pointed out the very interesting thing that she found from interviewing people at the Korean one. She started to realize that, these people who are native English speakers aren't really native English speakers. They're Polish people, in the case of the ones she talked to, Polish people who speak English well, and thus are passing as native English speakers because they pretty much just because they weren't Koreans, right? And so it was assumed that they must be native English speakers, but Kim spoke English to the extent that she was able to recognize, I don't remember what it was, phonological variation of some sort, and think these don't sound like British people or Americans. But that was enough, right? Enough that they looked like what a Korean might think of as a stereotypical speaker of English because of their fair hair and skin and light-colored eyes. Interestingly, I just put this here to show that it caught my attention that despite the focus on native English use, the website wasn't particularly native-like. Let's enjoy British Hills Halloween party seems a bit odd. Let's collect many sweets. It's just not quite natural, right? Despite being marketed as such. And what do I care if it's natural or not? It's not for me. It's written for Japanese people, so fine. But if it's marketed in one way as authentically English, but then it's not, there's a dichotomy between what they're saying and what they're doing, right? Yes, and it said, you will make scones, and I thought it was very, very, it's not imperative, but at least very forceful here. So yes, I won't go through this word by word. In fact, you may wish to pause here and read this from Kim's excellent discussion of this kind of thing happening in Korea. But as she says, is detrimental to the Koreans, right? It excludes the Korean non-native English speakers from teaching, not only in these villages, but it creates the feeling in the whole country that a Korean non-native English speaker teacher is just not as good, right? That it's a problem, and that we need to somehow, and it does happen, right? You can pay for private tutoring there, like in many other countries, from native speakers who are often not qualified as teachers. You can get a job in language school in Korea, in Japan, in China with a bachelor's degree in any subject. It doesn't necessarily have to be in English, and that's largely just because you have to have the bachelor's degree in order to qualify for a visa. And then you can go and work. And of course, some of those people will turn out to be excellent teachers, great, but some won't. And in both cases, they're getting that boost from their native speakerness that the Korean and Japanese and Chinese and other places, that the local teachers don't get, despite what may be excellent qualifications in teaching pedagogy and in language knowledge and in experience and so on. So I've written here, give them what they want. It's certainly notable that in no other field do we worry about such things, I think, right? I mean, I'm not as familiar, like, you mean the parents and teachers, students and their parents often who pay for extra lessons have these favorable attitudes. And so motivation may increase. And we, schools, especially the private system, take account of this. Students like it, let's do it. But we don't do that with other topics, right? We don't say, what kind of math teacher do you like? Do you like tall people or short people? Do you like left-handed people or right-handed people, right? I mean, we don't focus so much on who the students like with any other topic, as far as I know, and yet a lot of this is given. That's why the schools will say, well, we advertise the native speakers and we put pictures of non-local people on our flyers, of if you're in Japan, put pictures of people who are not Japanese on flyers in obviously in teaching roles because the students like it, right? And so I suppose that makes sense from a marketing point of view, but it doesn't necessarily make sense from a pedagogical point of view, right? And yet it's done throughout East Asia, as John and Lee say. But as I said, it's not something that we tend to account for student preference in other fields, right? And interestingly and reassuringly, as Ling and Brain explain, student attitudes change over time. They may be, when they're young, very happy to have a non-native English speaking teacher, and a lot of the lessons are focused on communicative activities, games, singing, riddles, puzzles, like that, right? But over time, the students come to realize that their teachers may not have the same awareness of language rules that their non-native English speakers who studied the language explicitly will have, right? I mean, you may well be familiar with this. Ask a typical native English speaker to explain the difference between tense and aspect. Ask them to explain, how past perfect works versus past simple, in other words, and they may not be able to explain that because they never had explicit instruction in how their own language works, right? And so students realize this over time, and especially as they get into secondary school and get ready for entrance examinations to university, for which you often have to write an English test, even if you're going to study in a lot of the world, even if you're going to go and study mathematics, economics, history, what have you, there will be an English exam as a kind of gatekeeping exam to get into university. English is just unfairly, of course, seen as a sign of general intelligence, and so you have to do well on the English exam, even though you have no desire to ever study English again once you get into university. Various people have tried to redefine this term of native English speaker, terms like this, right? It just doesn't work, right? Native speaker is too entrenched in the discourse about language use that it doesn't carry, right? Pennycook is saying, look at it from a cultural point of view, call Brits or Americans teaching in China the non-natives, because they are in fact non-native to the culture. But of course, people don't care about that. They care about the language, right? They're native to the language, and that matters. At least it matters, as we said, to the teachers and students, to the students and their parents, although over time, as we just said, the students' opinions may change. But yeah, so people have tried to redefine the terms, but it just doesn't really seem to work, and we're really stuck with that native, non-native usage. As Medgish says, it's not always accurate, but it's convenient, right? It may be, as Leung says, that it's sometimes hard to distinguish exactly, okay, we feel like people are native speakers, but where's the where's the line between native speaker and non-native speaker, right? I mean, you can make up examples like this, or these that I took from Boyle, right? If you're born in Poland and moved to America when you're 4, are you still a native speaker of Polish by the time you're 15? What should we say about someone like that, right? Well, probably not. I imagine if you're familiar with general theories or with Cattru's critical period hypothesis, probably having moved to America and switched to English before the age of roughly 7 to 9 probably means that she will be indistinguishable from a native English-speaking American-born person by the time she's 15, right? And so on with this, right? Can you lose your native speakerness of language A over time when you become much more regularly a user of language B? For the English for academic purposes classes that Westminster runs for undergrad students, they just had to make quite arbitrary rules to deal with this, right? If you're born in England, you don't get any English support, even though some students born in English could use English support, especially when it comes to EAP, English for academic purposes, right? If you were from Another country, you were considered, you got English for academic purposes, EAP support. What about all the immigrants? They made a quite arbitrary rule, 10 years or more, no English support, under 10 years, English support, right? These are obviously just, like I said, quite arbitrary, right? There's no clear line at which you suddenly become native. And of course, it would depend on at what age you immigrated too. So, to summarize, as we say here from Higgins, researchers have critiqued the native-non-native dichotomy for being more of a social construction, right? That we have these social ideas, society has these ideas about what native and non-native is, when there isn't really often, it's not even often easy to linguistically determine who native and non-native is, especially when we think of the fact that when, as I said much earlier, that native usage in terms of teaching and rule creation and codification is often thinking about natives of a certain type, right? Speakers of standard native English. It's the later part of this quotation that may be more troublesome, right? Can your own ideological stance towards your linguistic identity provide you with the self-assurance to label yourself, right, as a native user, a native speaker? You know, you're born somewhere, you move to an English-speaking country at a later age, or you're just a temporary visitor, like an international student, like many of you. Higgins seems to be saying that it's your own stance. I am a native user, and I shouldn't feel like I'm less proficient than a native speaker. But of course, and that may work for you, and you may feel confident about feeling that way and expressing yourself that way. But of course, you can't force people from the outside to judge you in the same way as your own ideological stance suggests that you want to be judged as. So, a couple of questions to think about. How can we balance the ideological stance, how someone feels, with the label they're given by others? That's the kind of thing where it may sound ridiculous that, well, how can we give weight to their ideological stance when they're judged from outside? But that's what I was trying to explain that is being done sometimes with regards to hiring of teachers or other professionals, of course, where where proficient language use is necessary, right? That it's more up to the person and less about seeing their passport or giving them any kind of language test, right? And I wonder what you think, those of you who are familiar with other languages, other cultures in which those languages exist. Do these discussions exist in other places with regards to other languages? Is English somehow different than all of these because of its international status, because of its importance for global business, because of the dominance of English as a language for teaching and learning? I'd be interested to hear what any of you have to say about that. Thank you very much. A lot of references here. Of course, you can pause if needed. I'll continue on to the next page to show the last of them. Good. Thank you for your time and attention. Take care. Bye.